Okay, good evening, everyone. So the last time we spoke about a question in Hilchot Shabbat. We're going to look at another question in Hilchot Shabbat. So last time we spoke about the question of the scenario was where somebody else was doing work for you at a time when it may or may not have been Shabbat. So over there, the case was that it was definitely somebody else doing malacha, but where they were, it wasn't Shabbat. Where you were, it was Shabbat. So I want to look at sort of an opposite case, which is where it's definitely Shabbat, according to everybody. Somebody who does work not in the sense of malacha, of forbidden work on Shabbat, because that is obviously forbidden by definition, but somebody who works, who provides a service on Shabbat. And this is a very, very common shaila that comes up. You could have it in the case of a babysitter. You could have it in the case of the chazanim. This question is asked. You could have it in the case of waiters, different things. People who are employed, who are paid to perform a service, again, which is not melacha, because if it was melacha, it would be forbidden to do, but you're allowed to do it on Shabbat. You're getting paid for it. And the question is, can you be paid? Because this is Maasim Shebachol Yom, that we see different people do different things and they get salaries for it on Shabbat. Is that allowed? How is that allowed? Where does it come from? So this particular question which is asked, and again, it's always fascinating to see how the questions are asked and where they are. So the question was posed in the following way. There was somebody who works for a youth group in a shul, maybe a youth director or whatever it is, and the shul has youth activities every Shabbat, primarily on Shabbat, Shabbat morning. But 3 or 4 times a year, they also have weekday activities, right? The Tu B'Shvat, Purim, Chanukah, whatever it is. So listen to the question came out. The person said, I work for a youth group, where I work for the shul in the capacity of serving the youth. Just about all of our work is on Shabbat. A few times a year, we have weekday activities. And he says, my friends who work there as well think that the weekday activities are just, apparently they weren't so successful. So they're just an excuse. They're just an excuse so that the shul can pay us to say that we don't actually work on Shabbat, we work during the week as well. And the question was, is that the reason? Does this work? And is there not maybe a better way? Right? The difficulty in the challenge that's being posed is that the person says, I work every week, right? Every month I'm being paid. Every week I'm there on Shabbat. It only happens 3 times a year, a limited number of times, and it's stretched out months apart that this weekday work takes place. Isn't it a little bit far-fetched to say that the payment that I'm getting every month is for these things which are the minority of times have to take place during the week? Okay, so that's the shaila. And as I said, it extends across to a lot of these different scenarios and different similar sort of questions. So starting at the beginning, whereas we have a concept in the Gemara and Nedarim, in other places as well, the Shulchan Aruch brings it in Siman Shin Vav, there is a concept of Schar Shabbat, meaning reward payment for something which a person has done on Shabbat. And the default position is that Schar Shabbat is asur, to be paid exclusively for something you did on Shabbat. The reason it's asur, again, it might sound surprising. One of the things, a lot of things which we intuitively know and think that are forbidden on Shabbat are actually asur d'Rabbanan. Sometimes it's surprising to people. So all sorts of commerce, buying and selling and doing business and trading with money, all these things are going to be in asur d'Rabbanan, because essentially the gzerah of Mekach u'Memkar. Why? Because the gzerah Rabbanan said so that you don't come to write. We have many, many different gzerot to prevent us from writing on Shabbat, which is asur d'Oraita. Therefore, there's an asur d'Rabbanan of Mekach u'Memkar. By the way, as an aside, there's a Ramban, beautiful long Ramban in Parshat Emor, where he talks about what Shabbat would look like, if it was just Shabbat d'Oraita. As I said, people sometimes are surprised, things which are so fundamental to the tzivyon and Shabbat, to the way that our Shabbat looks, which are Isurim only, quote unquote, d'Rabbanan. And the Ramban gives us a whole long description, which was done in his day. He says you could come, theoretically, if we were to keep Shabbat just on a d'Oraita and there were no Gzerot d'Rabbanan, he describes how you could have the marketplace would be open and people would come and bring all their wares. They would measure things out. They would sell. They would come and buy. They would do all their work and all their toil. It says you haven't violated a single malacha. Says the Ramban, but that's not Shabbat. But that's not why. And the Torah intended that it should be. It didn't give us all the details. We have a concept. Again, the Rishonim talk about this by Hilchot Chol HaMoed as well. Maybe it's not exactly the halachic concept here, but there's an idea of Masara Katov V'Dvar Chachamim, right, whereby the Torah gave the Chachamim the ability to establish, to say, how the Shabbat should look, again, in the way that the Torah intended. So it's definitely clear that the Dinim D'Rabbanan are part of the way that the Torah intended that our Shabbat should look. So be that as it may, one of these Dinim, related to Mekach or Memkar, comes to Schar Shabbat, as part of that said Rabbanan. You can't be paid for something which you do on Shabbat. So how can you be paid, including something which you do on Shabbat? So here we have the idea of Havla'ah, right? Havla'ah, which literally means when something is swallowed up, meaning that if the agreement is, if the contract, the payment includes other times and other work which is done, which is not on Shabbat, just during the weekday, that would be satisfactory. And as part of that, so if a person is hired just for one day and he's getting paid their daily wage, and that day is Shabbat, that's a problem. But if a person is hired for a period of a week, or a period of a month, even though there is a Shabbat within that, we say that the Schar Shabbat is muvla betoch amongst the payment for everything else, and therefore that would be permitted. Okay. In our case, again, so what's the difficulty? The difficulty is that this person is receiving their paycheck every month. It may have been in that month that there was no actual weekday work. And can you say there is Havla'ah? So in this particular Tshuva, the question is posed in the following way. If say, when we talk about Havla'ah, I'm going to give two different applications of Havla'ah, followed by possibly a third head. So the first question is like this. When we say that there's Havla'ah, that payment includes the work which is done, that is not on Shabbat on the other times, does it go by the period of payment, or does it go by the period of employment? Okay, what's the difference? If we say by the period of payment, so going back into our case, every month that the payment is taking place, does there have to be a certain, within that unit of time, was there Havla'ah? Or is there a more broad-reaching sort of concept of Havla'ah to say that if there is a contract, there is a relationship of employment which is set for a year, let's say, which is usually the case in these kind of situations, and within that year, the agreement is that the person is going to work so and so many times on Shabbat, so and so many times on the weekday. That is the time, that is the period, that's the unit of employment, which can't just be terminated without due reason. Then we would say the Havla'ah would be included in part of that. And if that's the case, then in this situation, that would be mutar, that would be allowed. Obviously, this only works in a situation whereby there is a fixed period of employment, whether it's a contract or not. But so to give another example, which I mentioned, babysitting. But if a person hires a babysitter just each time for that isolated case, you're going to ask the babysitter to come from 10 o'clock in the morning until 2 o'clock on Shabbat day. That's only Shabbat. There is no Havla'ah there, seemingly, and that's going to be more problematic. Okay, so that's the first heter possibly of Havla'ah. The second understanding of, again, to do with Havla'ah, of this idea of being swallowed up, of the Schar Shabbat being included as part of a broader package, is maybe, and this is very common as well, commonly quoted, not just the idea of, there's work on Shabbat and there's work on other days, but the work which is done on Shabbat is extended either to before Shabbat or to after Shabbat as well. So, for example, if we say that a person is going to be a waiter, what does that work entail? Not just serving the food at the meal, but it means coming before Shabbat to set up the hall. It means coming after Shabbat to clean up, for example. There's no question that the person can be hired to come before or to come after Shabbat to do that work. That would be included in the Havla'ah as well. We have a Chazan who is going to come and is going to daven from the Amud on Shabbat, Yom Tov, whatever it is. If part of the work is the preparation that has to be done, in terms of preparing the nigunim, etc., before there would have to be before, wouldn't work afterwards, right? But that would be included, and that would be Havla'ah as well. So maybe over here as well, you could say the same thing, that in terms of this youth group, whatever it may be, if the person is required to prepare the games, prepare the activities, in what many shuls do, they'll have some form of compulsory training or some sort of meetings which need to be attended, or phoning their parents, making some sort of contact, something that has to be done. before Shabbat, then that would be included. That would be suffice as part of the havla'ah as well. Two conditions. The contemporary poets can point out, or Chot Shabbat writes this, that in terms of this kind of havla'ah, it's got to be real. We're not talking about just a loophole here. We're not talking about harama. It needs to be, it has to be something which is obligatory. If you say, I'm hiring you to come and babysit, if you want, you can prepare before, you can practice what the games you're going to play or something. That doesn't count. Then that's just, you're adding it on. It has to be obligatory. And B, it has to be something which is significant, something which is time consuming, right? If you're going to say the person can arrive 30 seconds before to set up, you wouldn't really pay a person for 30 seconds, which they've come, and therefore those conditions would be necessary as well. So those are the two conditions, the two expressions of havla'ah which we find in the poskim, which would allow it not to be considered forbidden schar Shabbat. There is a third discussion which the poskim bring, which is very interesting, which may or may not apply to this case as well, and this is a little bit more contentious than the first two, but that is the sugya of schar mitzvah. Right? So you'll tell me schar mitzvah, but some people want a little bit more. They want to get paid as well for something which they do. So if the activity is a mitzvah activity, would that also be forbidden? Does the gzerah of receiving money for that apply to that as well? So that's a machloket. The Shulchan Aruch in Siman Shin Vav brings two opinions. He says asur liskol chazanim litpalel b'Shabbat. Says it would be forbidden to hire chazanim to come and pray on Shabbat. Again, this is assuming none of these other conditions we've mentioned of havla'ah, etc., would apply. He says it's forbidden. Ve'yesh mi shematir. There are those who allow it. We know, generally speaking, Shulchan Aruch stam v'yesh omrim. We go like stam. So the Shulchan Aruch holds like the first opinion. The Rama adds on. He says im scharo l'shana or chodesh l'kolei amashari. If you hired him for a week or for a month, and the implication being that they would perform services on weekdays as well. So then let's have that's not a question. So the Shulchan Aruch seems to say that the heter of schar mitzvah, there are those who allow it, but better to be stringent. Mishnah Berurah actually brings that there are amongst the Achronim, there are poskim who say that where this was the common practice, and therefore there is room to allow it. But as we said, the heter of havla'ah is much more widespread, much more common, and it's much more accepted amongst the poskim. In general, the question of whether this idea of schar mitzvah would even apply, right? In this case, a person is doing, the youth group or whatever. So it would depend on what kind of what the activities are. If it is that the person is coming and teaching the kids how to pray and learning with them or something, then maybe we could say that is a mitzvah. If it's just sitting there and playing games and eating sushi, whatever, so then maybe it's a little bit maybe it's a little bit more of a stretch to say. But together with the havla'ah, there seems to be a heter. Just going back to the babysitting question, right? So this is also what the poskim discuss. So again, the first case, our first heter of havla'ah amongst doing it at the times, if a person is just hiring the babysitter as a one-off to come on Shabbat, that this wouldn't apply. So if you made an agreement with them, you said, look, I need you to come and babysit on Shabbat, and I need you to come on Tuesday evening as well, and it's an absolute commitment, and there are other times, and all of that is part of the same agreement, then we could argue for havla'ah. If we were to say, number two, that the person needs to prepare something beforehand, maybe they need to, or if they need to bring something, they need to bring some food to give to the children they're babysitting. In terms of the compensation for those expenses, that could be included together with the havla'ah, and that may be as well. Heter number three, about whether it's a mitzvah. So again, there's more contentions. If someone is hiring a babysitter in order for a mitzvah purpose, so they can go to shul, they can do something like that, then there may be room to suggest as well that's considered a mitzvah. But as I say, the first two are the more accepted heterim. Ad kan. Rabbi Hanania ben Akasha.
Would you have to pay? Would it be all right to pay separately for the Shabbat, or do you have to be a havla'ah?
So we're saying havla'ah needs to come together. Rabbi Hanania ben Akasha